Welcome to Spotlight. With the war in Ukraine dragging on for over 9 months, the U.S. and Germany say negotiations with Russia are possible only after Russian forces leave Ukraine. The Kremlin says it's open to talks on a possible settlement to the conflict. It, however, adds the refusal of the U.S. to recognize 4 Ukrainian territories recently annexed by Moscow is hindering a search for any potential compromise. In this edition of Spotlight, we'll discuss the future of the Ukrainian conflict and the possibility of a solution to Russia's escalating standoff with the West. Joining us on tonight's Spotlight, we have activist and commentator Don DeBar joining us from Austin, New York. And also we have journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich joining us from Belgrade. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. DeBar. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says that Russia is open to talks to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, but finds it difficult to reach common ground with the U.S. Joe Biden said that he's prepared to speak to his Russian counterpart if Vladimir Putin is looking to pull troops out of Ukraine. So finding common ground and ensuring Russia's interests are the key words here. How do you see events transpiring from here on?
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to get any better, that's for sure. There are a couple of things that are in the mix right now at this moment. Number one, among them on Wednesday was Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, announcing that they want to try to assemble some sort of legal architecture, judicial architecture, in order to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Russia said, of course, that that's a non-starter. There's no jurisdiction. They certainly won't submit to it. Von der Leyen's looking for something backed by the UN. Russia and China will clearly veto anything that happens in the Security Council over this. So there's that aspect. There's also in Kiev a meeting of some group of the U.S. puppetry, basically, that are actively discussing, meeting that included people from the U.S. government like Victoria Nuland, that are looking at basically trying to do to the Russian Federation what was done to Yugoslavia, and that is to incite various nationalities that have been members of Russian state for hundreds of years into breaking up into constituent parts. This effort has been ongoing from the U.S. State Department really since the close of World War II, but over the past year it's been given an awful lot of life and funding, and they are now actively, first of all, announcing and actively seeking to dismantle the Russian state. Now, the problem with that, Russia's announced nuclear doctrine is we will use nuclear weapons in only 2 cases. 1, if they're used against us, and 2, if the survival of our state is threatened. And they are openly standing in Kiev right now, backed with people from the State Department and elsewhere in the U.S. government, announcing their intention to attempt to do that. So I think we have a real difference of opinion here and no forum where any rational discussion can take place. And it's entirely the fault of the United States.
John Bosnich, over to you now. Russia has accused Western countries of pursuing, quote, destructive policies by supplying Kiev with weapons and training the Ukrainian military, but now negotiations seem to be the only viable solution. On that note, Russia, the president, Vladimir Putin, believes that the political and financial support from Ukraine's Western allies has led Kiev to completely rejecting any form of negotiations. Do you see it in that light as well? Is that one of the reasons why the talks are not happening?
Well, I would go a step further than what they're saying, and that is that not only was this war planned back in the 1970s at least, and not only are the Ukrainians staying in the war because they're getting supplies and support financially from the United States for the war, but I would go one step further. I would say that they're actually being paid to stay in the war. They're actually being paid bribes by the U.S. government to continue the war with Russia as long as they can. We already have heard and read about the offshore bank accounts running into the tens of millions of dollars for Zelensky and the coterie of collaborators that he's got around him. So I would say that we're not just seeing the Ukrainian state being maintained by United States weapons and support, but we're actually seeing direct bribes to the political figures in Ukraine. And if they lose at the end, they'll be airlifted out to form some sort of a government in exile based out of Washington.
Well, Don DeBar, here's Europe's stance. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also urging President Vladimir Putin to find a diplomatic solution to end the war, including pulling out Russian troops from Ukraine. Now, let's rewind back to April. Multiple sources said that Russia and Ukraine, the negotiators, appeared to have agreed on a peace deal, but then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson prevented that from taking place. Boris Johnson reportedly told Ukrainian president that even if Ukraine is ready, Kiev's Western backers are not. Was that an opportunity missed?
Well, you have diplomacy and the realities of diplomacy, or perhaps the lack of it under these conditions. And you have the material means on the ground of conducting diplomacy by other means, which is warfare. There's been a war going on in that territory, that hot war, for the since essentially March of 2014, with casualties accruing constantly, and real estate being fought over, and destruction and havoc being wreaked everywhere. If Russia were to withdraw its troops in order to have a conversation, you would be leaving the NATO troops in the position of, and in fact further installed into a position to make war directly on Russia, blitzkrieg style. As a matter of fact, the position that they're in now, with the exception of Kazakhstan and Belarus, which successfully held back color revolution attempts over the past year, would be as far into the Soviet Union and into Russia as Hitler achieved with his entire offensive under Operation Barbarossa. That would be the starting point. If Russia, and Russia knows this, the military strategists know exactly what forces, what material is placed where, but how they'll be used in warfare to their best guess, studying history and warfare. And so they know, no matter what politicians are saying, that if they withdraw from here, they're going to be looking at the condition that was such a lousy condition for them to have to fight a war from, that they took the initiative in February after asking for the U.S. to withdraw their forces back to a safe place. So I don't see any possible space in the real world, forgetting diplomacy, for Russia to do anything but continue to fight the war until NATO pulls out. And NATO appears to have no intention of pulling out.
John Bosnich, staying on the topic, Boris Johnson's position was that of the quote-unquote collective West, which felt Putin was not as strong as they initially thought, and they saw the war as an opportunity to press Putin. Taking into account the ripple effects, specifically the energy crisis that Europe is facing now, do you think that was a miscalculation?
Well, once again, I like to step one step back from the PR campaign that the Western politicians run. It actually doesn't matter to their bosses whether the war is won or lost, this particular war in Ukraine, because the people who own the Western politicians are the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex just wants war whether they win it or not. In fact, if they lose the war in Ukraine, they should be able to sell many more weapons to the United States government to replace the ones that were sent to Ukraine. And then they should be able to use a bunch of fear-mongering to scare the American public and say, look, we lost the war in Ukraine. We've got to make many more weapons, many more nuclear weapons, many more aircraft carriers, many more airplanes. So for the military-industrial complex, it doesn't matter whether or not they win or lose this war. because they want the next war, the bigger war. For the politicians, of course, they've got to pretend that they're trying to win. But in fact, they are elected or defeated in elections that are paid for by donations and kickbacks and bribes from the military-industrial complex. So it is not a win or lose situation for the politicians of the West. It is not a win or lose situation for the military-industrial complex. It is just how much money can we rip off our taxpayers for, and how many weapons can we have destroyed by Russia so that we can make more, bigger, and better weapons at a much higher price tag. It's basically a robbery in which the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people are nothing other than cannon fodder going into the U.S. military-industrial meat grinder.
Don DeBar, Russia has time and again said that countries supplying weapons to Ukraine and training its soldiers were in fact parties to the conflict. The question is, as this support continues, will it lead to the conflict spilling over into other regions and possibly turning into something bigger? We saw what happened with Poland recently. That surely gave everyone a scare of how easily this could expand.
Well, the reports from the Russian military and also from the Western press are that more equipment has been poured into the area around both Belarus, and there's agitation about, political propaganda agitation about the role Belarus is playing to set up, a false flag, basically. That's in the offing. The material is being placed on the border there, also on the border of the little enclave near the Baltics, Kaliningrad, and it seems that there's going to be some sort of an attack outside of the territory of Ukraine that involves one or both of those places very soon. Russia's warning that the false flag, they have intel on this, but the U.S. is also making statements that indicate that this is where they want to take it. So once it's not contained in Ukraine, it's not contained in Ukraine. Russia understands, and they've been saying from the very beginning, who they're at war with. When they entered Ukraine in February 24, they did not do that after 2 months earlier announcing that Ukraine had to do this, that, or the other thing. They wanted NATO to pull back from Russia's borders, and they wanted NATO to not take Ukraine in as a hostile territory, another one on its border. So they know who the enemy is. What they're doing is playing a smart, strategic game that also has regard for human life, unlike the way the U.S. conducts wars. They're trying to conserve the people of Ukraine and the infrastructure of Ukraine as they fight this, and NATO is burning it in the hope that as it burns Ukraine and Ukrainians up, it's going to generate more profits. You have basically a self-financing criminal enterprise in charge of U.S. foreign policy, armed to the teeth with our $800+ billion budget that is at war with Russia on Russia's borders. That's the condition.
John Bosnich, the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, she says that the war in Ukraine has exposed European weaknesses and strategic mistakes in dealing with Russia. Can you expand on what she meant for us?
Well, it's hard to say what she meant because her words are being scripted from Washington now. The fact of the matter is here that all of these countries in NATO and in the EU are not real countries. These are American occupied military colonies. And if I were in the region, I would, and I have to agree with your other commentator today, Don DeBar, that the potential for a bait and switch, in other words, that they bait Russia to defend the Russian people, the ethnic Russians of Ukraine, while they actually make a lightning blitzkrieg strike against Kaliningrad or against Belarus. Because we have to remember that before this war took place, NATO and the EU attempted to stage a coup d'etat against the president of Belarus. So We do not know for sure whether the Western objective was a war in Ukraine or a war in Belarus or a lightning grab of Kaliningrad. These are all potential targets of the United States. And I have to say to you, sitting there in Iran, there could be a move on the part of America to take an attack along with Israel on Iran to divert resources away from Russia's defense in Ukraine. This is a hybrid war which is being fought on every level in every region. And it is not by chance that Nancy Pelosi made a visit to Taiwan at the same time. America is going for broke, and they're doing so under the guidance of their longtime masters in London.
Back to Don DeBar. Finland's prime minister believes that Europe is not strong enough to stand up to Russia alone, and that Europe's policy to have close economic ties with Russia have also been wrong. I think she was alluding to, in her words, making close economic ties with Russia and buying energy from Russia to prevent a war. First of all, do you agree with those comments? And what could have Europe done differently? Some say that blindly following the U.S. regarding this war was the actual mistake.
Well, let's look at the literal meanings of words for a minute. First of all, John correctly points out that Kaliningrad, Belarus, and also the attempted coup in Kazakhstan, Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, Iran, the U.S. government threatening just yesterday and today to make war on Iran if it doesn't sign on the dotted line, and Israel at the ready for that. World war. Those words have an actual common meaning. And when you have war going on in multiple theaters around the world, you have a world war. And the U.S. is fighting a world war. Russia is fighting a war on its borders, but knows it is involved in a world war. And so that's what we got. Sorry, my phone is, I turned it off. I don't know why that's possible.
All right, would you like to continue?
I have to go. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, the show's not over yet, but I'm going to cross over now to Mr. Bosnich, and we'll get back to you in a minute. Mr. Bosnich, a guest that, staying on that issue, a guest that we spoke to earlier took the Finnish Prime Minister's comments a step further and said not only Europe, but all of NATO actually cannot stand up to Russia. Do you agree with that assessment?
Russia is a strong military power. Russia is much, much, much more powerful today than it was when President Putin first came into office. And that is a direct result of President Putin's anticipation of the military actions of the United States. And we have to remember that President Putin first served as an intelligence agent. He has been inside the heart of NATO in Germany as an intelligence agent for decades. That means that he has a much better understanding of what is being done and exactly what was planned, when, and by whom. I would say that his interpretation of the aggressive nature of NATO is correct. And I think that the Finnish and the Swedish and the other moves are all just a trap that the United States laid to bring formerly neutral countries into the fold as military colonies. Even if this war ends in the near future, the United States has made a great advance by sucking in the Swedes and the Finns into the NATO military colony system. That is a definite result of this war, regardless of how things end on the battlefield.
Don DeBar, massive inflation, a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis. Some countries like the UK having its citizens face unprecedented energy bills, with many European countries facing energy rationing. What is the cost of this conflict and its repercussions for Europe as opposed to the United States? And also, are the European citizens on board with enduring all of these hardships?
looking at what's been happening, I find it impossible to believe that whatever the European citizens want is even being considered by the European governments, let alone the government in Washington. And what the governments in Europe want is also really not being considered by the government in Washington. John correctly pointed out that Europe is under a condition of military occupation by the United States and has been since 1945. The reunification of Germany, for example, was not the withdrawal of the four powers from Germany, which was the occupation imposed at the end of World War II by the US, UK, France, and Russia, or Soviet Union, but rather the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from its occupation of Germany, and ultimately the extension of the American occupation into all of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, up to Russia's borders. There's really no room whatsoever for considering the opinion of the people on the ground in Europe, and their condition is bad and getting worse. The winter that they talk about weaponizing against Ukraine in places like this Kiev confab and that van der Leyen talks about actually is also weaponized against the people of Europe by their own governments and by the U.S. government. And the casualties in the main are going to be suffered there over the next 3 or 4 months, and we're going to see that happen. And what may be the ultimate casualty there might be the governments that impose this kind of situation in the first place. They may find themselves on the end of an unemployment line or perhaps a line made out of twine.
All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have for tonight's show. Thanks to activist and commentator Don DeBar joining us from Austining, New York. And thanks to journalist, activist, and political analyst John Bosnich speaking to us from Belgrade. And a special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.